As we start out in the series of Belong, there's a few things that I want to define. First and foremost, belong, this word belong. It means to be part of something or showing possession. To be part of something or showing possession. That to belong is both possessional and participation. It's both possessional and participation. So what this means is that I could talk about belonging, and it could be like you belong to somebody, or an item belongs to you. But it also could mean that a sense of belonging and my participation in the thing that I have a sense of belonging to. And we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk a little bit today and lay some foundation on how these two bridge and communicate with one another, and how we're intertwined in this in our humanity. We're going to start out in the book of John chapter 11, and this is a story that I read a handful of weeks ago, and it's a story about Jesus dealing with some very, very, very dear friends of his who had a brother who was sick. And their brother's name, Mary and Martha, the brother's name was Lazarus. Lazarus was very sick. And they'd come to him and said, hey, would you do something about this? Like, we know that like you've been healing people, and you're really close here, and so we're kind of making ourselves a little bit vulnerable here, Jesus. We need help. And Jesus is like, I'll be there. I'm dealing with something right now, but I'll be there. And Lazarus ends up dying. And we're going to pick up in the story where Mary comes to him in verse 32. And it says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, one thing that I will promise to you is that I think I'm always going to try to bring some level of authenticity to the platforms that we have here. And what I mean by that is that I always encourage, if I'm speaking or leading worship, if whatever the team or whatever's happening, that we would be authentic, we would be real. But beyond that, I want you to know that I'm going to be vulnerable. And vulnerable is a little bit different. We're going to discuss what that means in a few minutes, but I'm always going to make my promise to you that I'll do my best to be vulnerable. Now, if I was being vulnerable with you right now, what I would tell you is that if I was Jesus and I was just approached by my good buddy, his sister, and you had died, and I'm approached and said, like, where have you been? In fact, if you would have been here, your friend, my brother, wouldn't be dead. My immediate response, based on the history in my life, and this is just me being vulnerable, based on the history in my life, is I would have felt a tremendous amount of shame for that. I would have felt like on the surface, because of that, what you were doing was there's a level of rejection that's beginning. And I'm saying, and I would be listening to the narrative based on what you said to me that would say, you need to separate yourself, and you need to begin creating distance between the person who said this, and I would begin acting in a defensive manner. That's me. I'm being really vulnerable, because the truth is that the hurts and the pains that any one of us in our lives have felt. So when I say this, I'm not exclusive. But the hurts and pains that are unique to you, maybe, how you process them, I know the hurts and pains that I have felt in my life, tell me a story on how I'm going to respond when I'm faced with this statement. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord. He begins to press in a little bit. He begins to move in a little bit. You know, she makes this statement. He doesn't run. He actually stays there. He stays present. And then he even moves in a little bit. Where have you laid him? He leans in with a question. So there's a narrative in my life that I tell myself, that I allow myself to hear. But Jesus, instead of listening to a narrative in the human part of his brain, he leans into the situation a little bit by asking a question. Where have you laid him? Come and see, Lord, they replied. And in the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. He feels this deep sense of empathy and compassion. that there's maybe moments in your life that you've been faced with a situation similar to this. And you're faced in that moment, like Jesus is faced in that moment, like he's completely exposed because he begins weeping. And that's a pretty vulnerable thing. He's not trying to hold us together. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" More shame, more rejection, more guilt, potentially more fear of what men think of you. Verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. He moved even closer. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. I love this quote. I don't know who actually said this. It's not my quote, so I want to be fair in this. Oftentimes people will quote me because I say something from the platform, but it's not my quote, so I want to be really clear about this. Somebody else said this. I just don't know who. And they said, the cornerstone of belonging is participating. The cornerstone of belonging is participating. See, today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about that if we want to belong to something, we have to show up. And to show up means that I'm going to be willing to participate. Now, let me define a few of these things. It means that I'm going to be willing to participate. To participate is to share or engage in something. That I'm going to participate. Participation, especially in America, participation is not showing up and filling a seat in a stadium at an event. Participation isn't being a father and showing up and being in the home, but being completely emotionally detached. That is not participating. Because I can, I watch this happen with kids. Like, I can eat the cookie in front of you and be completely present and participate with you in the room, but never actually share the cookie. Okay? And as adults, we just do this a little bit differently. We throw 3-year-old fits a little bit differently and over bigger cookies. Okay? And in my preparation for this, has anyone ever heard of a person named Brene Brown? Have any of you ever read her material? Okay. So there's a handful of you. That's good. Brene Brown is probably right now in our current, I would say in our society, in our culture, she is the leading voice as a social scientist on the issue of belonging. And I really utilized, and I'd heard her speak a little bit, and I haven't read an exhaustive amount of her material, so I'm not like an expert on what she says. However, I listened to a few things that she said, and it really struck a chord with me as a pastor, as a person, as a human, in my heart, in this idea of belonging. And one of the things that she talks about is this idea of, when we participate in something, it requires us, and this is the word she uses, is that it requires us to make ourselves vulnerable. Vulnerability is really, and there's a bunch of things attached to that you can read her material if you want or listen to her stuff. Vulnerability really is, I think, the key component. If the cornerstone of belonging is participating, in order for me to participate, is I have to be willing to be vulnerable. Now let me define vulnerability for you. Vulnerability is the state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed. Wow. Vulnerability is the state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, and that's either physically or emotionally. That's vulnerability. I'm going to give you a very quick idea of what vulnerability looks like in the real world. The other night, all 6 of my children happened to be not doing anything in the evening time, and so we said, oh gosh, we have everyone together, and so we went and we tried to watch this movie called Mary Poppins. I've never seen the original Mary Poppins, so I have no context. Don't be bummed. I'm not bummed at all. Not after seeing this movie. Hold on. It's not because of them. Well, listen to what happened. So I go see it. I got all 6 of my kids, and so there's 8 of us that show up. So we got to get there early because we got to get a seat. So we get there a little bit early. We go in, and like I love introvert's dream. I walk into the theater, and lo and behold, no one's there to watch Mary Poppins. So we take middle of the row, middle of the whole theater, and of course no one's going to sit next to us because we take up the whole row. And I love that. Again, as an introvert, I'm just like, double win. This is great. People start filtering into the theater. We get about halfway into the movie, and we start hearing this voice, and we're like, what is this voice? And somebody is like on a cell phone talking unbelievably loud in the middle of the movie. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And so people are like looking around, trying to figure out what it is. And then me being who I am, I'm like, I'm done looking around. And I got up and I just started walking toward the voice. And I'm like, I want to know who's having this conversation. And so I approach, and as I'm approaching, the voice goes away. And I think that whoever it was saw me coming and was like, okay, there's a dude in like a red Pendleton and a beanie, and he's walking up the stairs. And I was not happy. It wasn't happy Pastor Pat. Right? So I was like, who? And it was like, because it had gotten to the point where it was like, this is crazy. And people had gone and complained and nothing was happening. And so I realized as I approach, I figure out who it is. And I realized this gentleman stopped talking when I approached, but I also realized that he had no cell phone on him. He was having a conversation with himself, okay? Which led me to believe there were some other issues. And so I went, oh, wow, this is interesting. So I went back and I was like, dude's crazy. He stops, so we go sit down. 5 minutes later, he starts having this full-blown conversation again. People in the theater start yelling, shut up. Families are moving away from this guy. This young man gets up and goes and leaves the theater, comes back, and when the young man comes back, he's like, hey, man, and tries to like just reason with the guy. And the guy starts yelling at him a bunch of obscenities, and he's belligerent, and he's telling him that it's free speech, and that he bought a ticket to be there and he can talk and all this other stuff. And then some of his language was real colorful. And again, I got all my daughters with me, and we've lost like this like chivalry in society. Like, dude, if you want to cuss like a sailor, go for it, bro. But my wife and my daughters are here, and you better watch it, because you may cuss like a sailor, but my wife fights like a sailor. Like, she grew up in the hood, so if you think for one second, like, that's cool. So there's a part of me, too, as a man, where I'm just like, oh, my gosh. It's not like my kids have never heard this. I mean, okay? But I'm like, bro. So I go out and I just politely tell the manager, this is what's going on. She's like, oh, my gosh. So she calls security. They go in. I didn't know this in a movie theater. Security can't actually do anything. Did you know that? So all they did is they came in and said, sir, can you please leave the theater? And he just looked at him and said, no. I not only bought 1 ticket, I bought 2. And I went, for you and your friend. And so he's like, I ain't leaving. I paid. Nobody can make me. And then he starts using all these other excuses. And so the security literally was standing there. And I turned around and looked at the guy and said, dude, what's going on? And the security goes like, I can't do anything. We have to wait for the police to get here. Now, I'm sorry, but it's 2019 now at this point. And I'm thinking, we have seen far too many issues in public. And so I'm like, I'm not leaving any chance. Like, you're going to, like, so there was a lot of emotion in me thinking about, so we're going to wait for the police to get here. Now it's a crime scene. Okay, this is what's going on in my head. Why? Because I was feeling vulnerable. Not only, and I'll be honest with you, I wasn't worried about me. I was thinking about my kids. And there's a bunch of other families in the theater. And so I just was like, oh my gosh. And so the guy had quieted down though. So I go sit down. Within like 30 seconds, I look over and the dude's walking down the aisle. And I was like, oh, he's going to leave. Until he makes a left-hand turn down the aisle I'm sitting in. And he sits 1 seat removed from me. Because, of course, we don't ever sit next to each other in theaters or in churches. Okay? Is anyone sitting here? Good. Well, I'm going to put my bag here and we're going to build a wall. And we build these weird walls. I see now you guys are feeling uncomfortable because there's a seat between you and the person next to you. And some of you are married. You need to get close. Listen, if you guys argued on the way here and you're sitting a seat removed, just go ahead, scoot closer right now. Just take the opportunity. I'm giving you a seat. I see some of you just move closer. Oh, man. Okay. Just gently put your hand on his leg. The oxytocin will kick in and you'll love him again. I know you said I hate you before you walked in the door, but you'll love him again. So the dude sits down like a seat removed from me, and at this point I'm like, and I looked at him and I said, dude, there are families in this theater. Why don't you just leave? I don't need you sitting here. I have my family here. And the guy just like looks at me and then just looks back at the screen and completely ignores me. And I stood up and I was like, and the security guard approaches me because I stood up. Thinking, this is funny. I'm the one being made to feel. My kids, families, and at that point, I just said, and families are really, kids are crying. They're scared. And I just said, everyone out of the theater. The vulnerability, the level of potential threat was too, I said, everyone out of the theater. Security guard wasn't saying a word. See, because they're worried about, they want to save their money. So this is what's in my head. So I'm okay, everyone. So we begin to leave, and the dude's like walking closer behind me, and I like stop, and then he sits down, and then this whole thing, and then we get our refund. Two of my kids are weeping. Okay, why? Because they feel vulnerable. And of course, we all get in the car and we're going to leave, and my kids are like, no, don't leave. And my wife's like, why? And they're like, because we want to watch him come out in handcuffs. So now we're parked in the parking lot. And it was so cute because when he came out, like one of my kids, I won't say which, you could see like their justice had been, and their sense of vulnerability began to dissipate. They're like, yeah, that's right. This picture that I'm painting with you is life. I can never promise you that when you show up to the church at the movement, nor as a parent could I ever promise one of my children that life is not going to present the possibility for harm. But what happens is typically the older we get because of experiences, we begin to put up things to protect ourselves. Our brain is wired to do one thing. Did you know that? It's to protect this body. It will tell this body to do what it needs for self-preservation. So one thing that I promise you, that if you show up and you choose to belong here to this family, because it is your choice. If you choose, I cannot promise you that you won't be presented with issues that are going to make you want to pull back because of maybe issues that you've experienced in the past, or maybe that we just did something and it wasn't the right way to handle it. But we have to dare to be vulnerable. We have to step in and participate. Are you with me this morning? And I love that Jesus shows up even in the midst of him being made to feel like he's really exposing himself and he's being attacked. So what happens? These guys come to him, and maybe you've experienced it in your life. I know in my life, again, I'm just going to be vulnerable on me. I know in my life, multiple areas of my life, I've always said these words. I just don't feel like I fit in. And so I begin judging and viewing things from this position of me feeling like I don't fit in. Not positive. Depression. Thoughts of suicide. High levels of anxiety. Some of you can relate to this. But I love that Jesus shows up. He's willing to expose himself, even in the midst of these guys saying this. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? This is what they're saying. Hey, Jesus, you don't belong here, because if you did, you would have done something about it. Your performance dictates whether or not you belong here. And the truth is, belonging has nothing to do with performance. It has to do with what you believe internally. This is the social science part of it. It has nothing to do with what these guys said. In fact, you don't belong here, that statement only matters if you believe the statement. It only matters if you have come into agreement with the lie that you don't belong. And so I'm going to always be committed to doing everything I can that we have environments where there's safety to promote vulnerability, knowing that in our humanity that I'm exposing myself to attack as a pastor by wanting to create that environment. Because what I'm doing is I'm saying, come here, this is a place we can be vulnerable, we can come to Jesus, we can come to each other, we can let our guard down, knowing that we're going to get it wrong sometimes and expose ourselves to the attack of someone who doesn't believe that they belong, and so what they want to do is lob a bomb at me. I'm being vulnerable. So it's the idea of if you jump, I'll jump. But you jump first. So we get stuck in this like weird, tense battle. You know, when you're a kid and you did this, like, okay, on three, we'll do on three. Okay, 1, 2. And we used to do this when we were kids. We'd jump into the cold ocean and we were like, on 3, okay? And we like, whoo, and it's freezing cold. It's wintertime and we didn't have wetsuits. We're like, on 3, okay, you go and I'll go. Okay, 1, 2. And there's always that kid, you get to 3, you jump in and they go, Were you that kid? Or were you the sucker that jumped? Because I'm going to tell you something that most of us at some point in our life, we've been the sucker that jumped. And so the brain says, I refuse to be vulnerable now as an adult because I never want to get suckered into jumping into the cold water and exposing myself again. Right? So belonging is an internal truth. This is important for us to understand. Belonging is an internal truth. Belonging isn't something that like I'm waiting for you to give me permission to belong. And I'm going to tell you something. You belong here because you belong to God as one of his creations. This is a tough thing, sometimes even for churches or Christians. And this is where we get this idea that in order for you to belong, you got to be you got to be a fish that's already been cleaned. The reality is I want you to be a mess when you come in the door. That tells me that we're doing something right and having an environment where you can be vulnerable. 4 people are happy about this. No. Listen, I'm laying foundation for culture here. This is important. This is really, really important. And what happens is that we project our ability to belong to something on other people. We hand them the keys. You would never hand someone, let me say this, I never would have put the situation I dealt with in the theater in anyone else's hands. I put it in my hands. But we do that with our sense of belonging. Well, they just don't make me feel like I belong. Well, no. You actually have agreements with issues that make you feel like you don't belong. And so when I do something that it's not perfect for you, when somebody does something that's not perfect for me, I get defensive. Because there's already a notion inside of me that something is wrong with me. I already feel a sense of shame. You just unearthed that shame. But I would never tell you that because that would require vulnerability. So I'm just going to beat you for it. Hello. You guys feeling the weight of this idea of belonging? You guys feeling it? Okay. That or we need caffeine. This is a pulse check, okay? Because listen, I'm being vulnerable. I'm going to drive this into the ground. I say I'm going to show up on a Sunday and I'm going to preach to you. And I'm being vulnerable right now and telling you, I want to be sure that I know what it is that you guys are sensing right now. So I'm exposing myself. Are you guys with me, or do we need to stop and we need to bum rush the canvas for some caffeine? So it's weighty, isn't it? Can I get... It's not about me. I'm going to stop all my thoughts right now. Jesus moved forward. These guys say this to him, and he made a decision that I'm going to step in. Where did you lay him? He moved in by asking a question. I would have moved out. This is what we do. In our society right now, we're faced with this cruel reality. We do not know how to live past agreement. If I disagree with you, you disagree with me, we're polarized. I hate you just because of the way you vote. I'm what I've called a wham. I'm a white American male. My own term for myself. Hold on, this is important. Who happens to be a Christian. In our current culture, when I say that, there's a poll that was just done at the end of 2018 that just came out, the results, that when you see me and hear that I'm a pastor, that 30% of society looks at me favorably. 70% of society looks at me and they have an assumption about who I am, who I vote for, how I live my life, who I'm married to, what she looks like, what color her skin is. That religion is aligned with politics. And the truth is that this is why people, like, they're having a hard time feeling like they belong somewhere. If they feel like that, if America feels like to be a Christian and sit in church in America, because this is what the poll shows, you have to be a Republican, therefore you have to believe in everything Trump does. Can I be vulnerable? 70% of America says, no thank you. Because they can't separate, because this is what we do. We begin clumping people together. And it puts me in a position of not wanting to be vulnerable, and puts you in a position of not wanting to be vulnerable, because now we just want to talk about how much we hate these things about each other, but we don't really like anything about the people we're clumping with. This is a finding that Brene Brown found. That we're living in a society now that we're not clumping together, and we don't get a sense of belonging based on what we like about each other. It's based on what we dislike or hate about others. So that's why that I can be part of this tribe, I can be part of this group, I can be part of this gathering, and it's not based on the fact that I like you, JR. It's based on the fact that we have similar dislikes. So when JR gets that phone call, and maybe JR, and God forbid, JR's sitting and he's getting chemo, no one in the group shows up to sit with him because they never really liked him to begin with. They just all disliked the same thing. This is what social science is finding. Fascinating. And the key to this idea of belonging to something that's bigger than you, there's something built into you, that God built into you, that you have this innate desire to belong to something that is bigger than yourself. And the enemy does everything possible to keep you and I on our heels, where we won't be vulnerable. We won't expose ourselves to the possibility of attack. So what we do is we run and we find other people that are in agreement with the things that we dislike, and we huddle around that. Isn't this a perfect picture of where we're at socially? So Jesus moves out of a sense of belonging. Jesus, he's the Son of God. Like on the surface, he didn't belong just because he was the Son of God, but altogether he belonged because he was on a mission, and he said, I actually belong because I'm doing what the Father told me to do, and I belong to the Father, so I'm going to do what the Father does, and I'm a son of the Father, and if the Father says I belong, I can walk up in this place and start grabbing all the candy out of the receptionist's desk if I want, because I belong. Do you know that, like, there's a swagger to the kid whose dad is the CEO or mom is the CEO? Right? They like walk up in the building and they're just like, hey, hi, how are you? Park wherever they want. Start taking. I mean, and now, I pray you're raising your children better than that. That's entitlement. But there's something to be said about the identity of a son who I know who I belong to. So you can say that I don't belong all day long, but there's something inside of me that tells me different, that I've been marked. In fact, with Jesus in his life, it happened in Mark, this book called Mark, Chapter 9, verse 7, Jesus had just been baptized. His cousin, John the Baptist, had taken him under the water and brought him up, and it said this cloud fills the space and covered them, and a voice came from a cloud, said, this is my son whom I love. Listen to him. Jesus is like, I know who I am, and I belong because of what the Father says. I don't belong because a few of you religious people want to tell me that I should have done a better job, and if I would have been here, my buddy wouldn't have been dead. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what vulnerability does. Vulnerability is actually a pathway to victory. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to move in and ask a question. So he asked the question, where'd you lay him? We are partners with, we belong to God. And we do what he does. I love this scripture. 1 Corinthians 3:9, for we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. In Romans 8:15, so you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children. Now we call him Abba Father. Now here's the problem. Just like if I went out and I adopted a child, whose responsibility is it if I do everything I possibly can to make that child feel like they belong? And that adopted child who was an orphan is now adopted. And I've talked to friends that have adopted children. And these children will hit their adulthood. And every once in a while this happens where that child just says, I never felt like I belong, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, the parents are crushed because they did everything they could to provide an environment where they could be safe and be vulnerable. And they raised these children and gave them such a good life. And the child says, and this is what it comes down to. I just never believed that I belonged. We've been adopted. I could tell you all day, every Sunday that Jesus loves you more today than you thought he did yesterday. There's nothing you can do to actually make him love you more or less. And beyond that, whose responsibility is it to actually step into belonging? Yeah, it's yours and mine. So this terminology that we've been adopted into sonship and daughtership, the responsibility lies on us. We need to have a gentleness, and we need to do what we can to always, I think, in those critical moments, love people and do what we can to create that environment. But at the end of the day, it's up to you and me if we really, it's something that lies inside of us. And I love that out of this belief of belonging and this idea that Jesus is like, I am actually on a mission to participate. I'm willing to show up. I'm willing to be vulnerable. He steps even closer. And in verse 38 it says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. When you and I are faced with that opportunity to run or step in and press in. See, Jesus pressed in. From the very beginning of our history and our relationship with Jesus, when he showed himself in human form, he actually was making himself vulnerable. And it wasn't predicated on what the other person did. In fact, it says that he made himself so vulnerable, he did it to the point of death. Even death on the cross is what this scripture in Philippians says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. It wasn't predicated on what everyone else was doing. If it was predicated on if my sense of belonging was predicated on what you do and what everyone else around me thinks, I got a problem. We would have a problem. Jesus' ability to maintain vulnerability led to our victory because nobody was in agreement with him. All the people that were closest to him, they fled. They denied him. He was sold out by one of his friends. You talk about having a sense of not belonging. Jesus still said, I'm going to go to the edge and I'm going to make myself vulnerable. I'm going to expose myself to the point of death. Because it's something that I carry inside. I belong here. This is who I am. No one can take this from me. Attached to this is a mission. Attached to this is and who I am are all the things that I will do because of it. The key for me is wherever it is that we feel like we don't really fit, we don't really belong. Jesus is telling me the key is that I actually need to move closer, not further away. So many times in life, as we move further away from each other, it ends in divorce. It ends in divorce in our marriage. It ends in divorce in our relationship with our employer or employees. It ends in divorce with the church. So fascinating. I just don't feel like I belong. Oh, really? You talk to a person called, I just don't feel like I belong at the church. I'm like, that's interesting. I've been watching, like, you're saying that from a distance. Are you connected? No. Well, then it stands to reason you feel disconnected. I feel disconnected because you are. I just don't feel like I'm close because you're not. Well, this happens, blah, 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 blah. I get the story. Okay. Are we willing to move in and make ourselves vulnerable? Hey, this is what happened. Can we talk about this? Because I know the enemy would love us to be divided and not feel like we have a sense of belonging. To the degree that you and I are willing to show up, to participate, and be vulnerable, is the degree that we're going to feel like we belong. In 2019, I'm preaching this message and laying a foundation because in 2019, my goal is that every one of us, not because of external factors, but because of something inside that we know and believe, that every one of us would know that we belong. And it's going to take vulnerability. Next week, we're going to talk about gathering, showing up, not showing up on a Sunday. Get in a community group, get in a life group. But that requires vulnerability. Well, Pat, I tried that out before, and you see what had happened was, there was this person who was really irritating in the group. They're like human sandpaper, and I'm like, well, maybe the rough edges that you have, God was providing the sandpaper to smooth you out. And you know what's attached to that when you hear that? Oh, you're saying it's my fault. No. Don't come into agreement with that lie. Because what's rising up is rejection and shame and guilt and fear. And what I'm saying is we have to be able to have these conversations and be vulnerable with one another and not get defensive. Know that I'm saying this in love. I will tell you, we need to step into relationships, be vulnerable. I don't have soon-to-be 7 kids because my wife and I decided to sleep in separate bedrooms, never be exposed to one another, never become vulnerable. Hey, when Jesus chose to be vulnerable, there was a life that was given. Because right after this, he speaks to Lazarus and he says, come out. And Lazarus walks out. When you and I decide to be vulnerable, when I'm saying my wife and I, we're showing you what vulnerability does. It produces life. When we choose to be vulnerable with one another and step in, next week we talk about gathering, getting to know other people, letting yourself be known. Then we're going to talk about serving. Oh, God, that's a whole nother level. Then we're going to talk about tithing. Oh, good God, I'm not coming back. I had a resolution to go to church every day, but now I'm done. And then we're going to celebrate the last week about reaching out, by reaching out and inviting the community. Hey, you want to watch Super Bowl? Totally free. Just come and watch it. It's going to be food. It's going to be a great time. Hang out. It all requires us to show up and participate and be vulnerable. Why don't you stand with me? Here's an exercise for us. Before I give you this exercise very quickly, how many of you after my message last week, I talked about dreaming and like setting goals with dreams and all that stuff. So I think what's going to happen, because I've gotten a lot of questions and there's a lot of different things that have come up, I might circle back around and do a series on just called Dreamers, and just talk about all the dreams in the Bible, people that were dreamers, because it has caused a lot of questions. It's very interesting, the questions that I'm getting from people. But how many of you guys went home this last week and you thought about your dreams? How many of you wrote your dreams down? How many of you attached goals to those dreams? Wow, that's interesting. So you know what's funny? I'm the preacher, and I'm supposed to preach to you and tell you, so did I do it? No. Being vulnerable. Now I'm going to be vulnerable, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I'm about to give you another exercise, but I'm going to tell you, some of you are like, I ain't doing it. He probably doesn't do it. In this case, I didn't do it. Do you know why I didn't do it? Fear. The best thing I can do is drag it out into the light, because it's the same thing you're dealing with. Sunday night I go sit down and I'm having like a barbecue with some friends, and somebody that was sitting in our 11:15 service is there, and they don't normally attend our church, and the guy looks at me and it's just like the most pointy question. He was like, so what are you dreaming about? And I went, right now that I wasn't talking to you. And you know what I realized? And that hit my heart so bad. Like, I was like, oh. So Thursday night after our disaster of Mary Poppins, we went home and we start making dream boards, and my kids, and we're cutting things out of magazines, and I still haven't done mine. All of my stuff is in a little plastic bag, and it says Pat, my wife, so sweet, she puts it in a bag. I still haven't done it. You know why I haven't done it? She looked at me and she goes, well, you can read my dreams. And I go, oh. She goes, can I read yours? And I go, I don't have any written down. She goes, why? And I said, quite honestly, what was step number 1 of dreaming? Allow yourself. I said, I don't feel like I'm allowed to dream. I'm afraid to. Ooh. That's vulnerability. I don't feel like I add up. I don't feel like I have what it takes. When I say step in and belong, participate and be vulnerable, some of you are processing this and saying the same thing. So when I say to you, here's the exercise, I want you to go home and I want you to begin to write down the lies that you've come into an agreement with. And I guarantee you, some of you just, on the surface, you're like, I just don't want to do it. Ask yourself why. Every time you answer, when you ask yourself why, ask yourself 7 times why. You will get to the heart of it. You will figure out why it is that you're not willing to sit down and do the dream board. Why it is that you're not willing to sit down and approach your vulnerability. Why is it, do you think, that the enemy will want you to belong to anything in the world except to Jesus Christ and the church? Because if he knows that if you realize how presently powerful this is, how presently powerful this idea of vulnerability and belonging is, if you and I realize that we are unstoppable, because we're going to expose the lies of the enemy. He wants to keep us from exposing ourselves, but truthfully, he doesn't want to be exposed. What are the lies? Go home, write the lies down. You know what? If you want to take it a step further, share those lies with people. Hey, you know what, bro? I've been believing, I've come into agreement, I've been married to, I'm sleeping with the enemy on this. This is, like, I firmly believe we're going to start our year, and if we want to really have a place where we belong, we have got to break the neck of the enemy here. We have to. Because we can say, oh, belong, 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 and then we all go to our separate corners and we say, I'm going to keep the wall up, I don't want to be exposed, I'm not going to be vulnerable, right? Let's pray. God, right now, just the anointing of your presence and your spirit, God, would fall on this place. That there's not one of us in the room that's exempt. I don't care how much money you make. I don't care what kind of car you drive. I don't care where you were last night. I don't care where it is you think you're going. That every single one of us is faced with this in our humanity. That we want to know that we're loved and we belong. And when it comes to belonging, it requires a deep, 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 deep sense of vulnerability. So God, I'm asking for more of that. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be disruptive. It's going to interrupt the things that I'd rather be doing the way that I'd rather do it, God, because you're going to pull me into deeper vulnerability. So God, I am saying I'm coming to agreement with the truths of who I am, that I'm a son, and that I'm going to do what you do, and I'm going to say what you say. And these are the things that you speak over me, and I refuse to be bound to, married to, or sleeping with the enemy of the lies, telling me that I'm something other than what it is that you say. That God, something deep inside of every one of us that we would understand, that we would believe, that we would partner with, that we would jump into an intimate relationship with the truths that you say, that we would know without a shadow of a doubt that we belong. And when other people may say, and when the voices may say that we don't belong, we can begin speaking to them with that childlike kind of favor and like, you know who my dad is? Do you know where he sits? Do you know what he said about me? I belong because my daddy told me that I belong. I belong because my daddy sits in the penthouse office. I belong because he's the one who said that I can walk and tread on the lies of the enemy. I belong because he told me I was worthy. I belong because he told me that I was worth it. He showed me that I was worth it by sending his son Jesus. I belong not because you say I belong. I belong because my God, my Father, my Creator said that I belong. Ha! That's what I'm saying to myself when I'm watching Mary Poppins. If you need prayer this morning, never ever do we want to walk out of here without these two things happening. If you need prayer this morning for anything, when I brought up worthiness, some of you have such a deep sense of lack of worth. This is the most difficult message in the world for you to hear. Whatever it is, if you need prayer, you can begin coming forward right now. You don't even have to wait to the end of the service. Come forward. We have a team that would love to pray for you. I never want to end a service without giving an opportunity for any one of you to come into a relationship with Jesus Christ, the most vulnerable example, the one and the only living, breathing example of what vulnerability can do. If you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ this morning, I would ask that you could come forward at the end of the service, if you're more comfortable doing so, just to my left, to your right, and there's a few people that just want to pray with you for a few seconds. Spend some time with you, not to counsel you, want to come alongside you so that you know that you belong. And this requires vulnerability. There's 101 reasons in your head why you don't want to come forward for prayer or come forward and accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. There's 101 reasons why you wish that I would just finish and be done because it's uncomfortable. I'm being serious. Because you're faced with your vulnerability. So let's create a church where we just raise our hand in silence when everyone's head is down, and let's not expose ourselves to anybody and tell anyone that we have a relationship with Jesus, which, by the way, we'll do when we walk out the door, and no one will ever know that you love Jesus. And by the way, we'll never bring the goodness of Jesus to people if we're hidden spies. I'll let that lie right there. And just say this. God, you asked for our heart before you asked for our hand. And you're asking for our hand to partner with you and participate. And so I conversely am asking you, family, whether it's your first time here or your 500th, would you step in and belong in 2019? Would you be willing to participate, make yourself vulnerable, get uncomfortable? Thank you, Jesus. In Jesus' powerful name, everyone said, amen. I'll see all of you next Sunday.